Hello, dear readers and viewers of our social media platforms. Today we are joined by a renowned analyst, Dr. Theodore Karasik, an expert and analyst, one of the most knowledgeable specialists on the Middle East, the South Caucasus, and Central Asia. Dr. Karasik is a senior advisor at the Gulf State Analytics think tank in Washington, as well as an expert affiliated with the Jamestown Foundation and the New Alliance Institute. His articles are published in Arab News, Eurasia Review, Modern Diplomacy, and his consultations are used by government institutions in the United States and Gulf countries. By education, Dr. Karasik is a historian and anthropologist specializing in Islamic movements in Eurasia after the Soviet transformation. Dr. Karasik, welcome. In several of your publications, you mention that Central Asia is becoming the northern flank of the Persian Gulf. What exactly do you mean by this definition? And in your opinion, how deeply will the UAE and Saudi Arabia integrate into the infrastructure of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan?
This is an excellent question because it goes to the heart of how Gulf states view Central Asia. The Gulf states, in particular UAE, for example, and Oman, have had decades of relationships with Central Asian states that were formulated even before the end of the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union, these Gulf states began to grow their relationships quietly at the leadership level and eventually into contracts. Now, contracts between from the Arabian states into Central Asia have evolved over time because of the nature of contracts and because of the nature of what is exactly the Gulf states' view of where Central Asia should be. Now, when you look at UAE has a pretty sophisticated foreign policy that's dedicated to trying to, if you will, integrate Central Asia greater into the Gulf or Arabian Peninsula affairs, including economics, energy, and other domains of mutual interest. So what we're witnessing here is an evolutionary process of the integration of the Arabian Peninsula states with Central Asia. This should not be a surprise to people because it's actually based on historical connections. Go back, if you will, to the history of Jeddah merchants trading with merchants in Uzbekistan because of the holy sites there. There was a route that was very popular in the past. What we're doing is re-energizing these old routes with new ideas of cooperation. So I see that the Gulf states have expanded their reach into Central Asia in the hope of bringing stability to the region based on their model. There are a lot of similarities in societies between Central Asia and the Gulf states. There's some differences, of course, but there's some mutual respect that occurs, and that's what we're witnessing today.
In one of your recent podcasts, you mentioned that the war in Ukraine has opened a window of opportunity for Gulf states to strengthen their positions in Central Asia. Could you clarify which specific instruments and alliances, in your opinion, are being used by Riyadh and Abu Dhabi in the region?
Relationships between the Gulf states and Ukraine have developed over time and accelerated, particularly during the war with Russia. And this is has put the Gulf states in an intermediary role because they, as Gulf Arabs, typically play both sides because they want to maintain good relationships with both because they're seeking an off-ramp so that this war in Europe will end and they, the Gulf states, can continue to pursue their economic planning that goes through 2030 and 2040. A war in Europe doesn't help them. So this is a motivating factor for for the Gulf states to get involved in Ukraine and Russia simultaneously. You'll see this with prisoner swaps. You'll see this with contracts that come up for reconstruction. You'll see it also with development of the middle corridor, because that's also in the Gulf construction. Now, bringing this over to Central Asia, the Gulf states are looking at the Ukrainian theater, the requirements for a middle corridor that are coming from Europe, and the Gulf states are working hard in Central Asia to make this middle corridor in cooperation with some Western interests, but mostly their own, because they see, the Gulf states see the interconnectivity between Central Asia and Europe through rail and other modes of transportation, and now's the opportunity to do it. We are seeing a great amount of attention to the transport networks and hubs around Turkmenistan or Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, and really the ideas that have been floated in the last few years about how the Ukrainian theater is affecting these logistic routes of whether they'll be running north or south, north and south, or whether they'll be running east-west. And that goes through, that policy goes through fits and starts because of local politics, as we've recently witnessed with Azerbaijan, Armenia, and discussions that are going on there about the corridor and transportation nodes that also tie into Iran. I know that's kind of a map, if you will, but at the same time, it's very important to recognize that what happens in the Ukraine-Russia theater now has a direct impact on the outcome of these Central Asian plans that are being backed by Central Asia, by Gulf states.
Thank you.
How do you assess the model of the Astana International Financial Center? In your view, is it perceived by Western strategists as an alternative to Chinese instruments of influence, such as the Belt and Road Initiative?
AFC is actually very interesting because this entity has gone through a number of fits and starts because of Kazakh domestic politics. Now it's beginning to take off. I'd like to back up for a moment there because AIFC is tied to two different entities in the UAE, one in Abu Dhabi and one in Dubai, and they form kind of a triangle of investment and operate sometimes together. There was talk about making Sharia compliant business through all three at one juncture. So there is negotiation ongoing about how AIFC is supposed to function. AIFC to me is an up and coming body that has growth pains because of regional and extra-regional politics. But AIFC to me has a more promising future, especially under President Tokayev, who sees the value of AIFC as a cornerstone of Kazakhstan's future outreach to various parts of the world. I mostly focus on their activity in Southeast Asia or desire in Southeast Asia, and where the Gulf states come in to help this body with their networks and contracts. So the outlook for AIFC under Kazakhstan is positive.
Thank you, Mr.
Dear readers and subscribers, why are we asking Mr. Karasik about the situation in the Middle East? The reason is that Mr. Karasik has worked at the Jamestown Foundation, Gulf State Analytics and Rand Corporation, has lectured in Dubai, and conducted research for Gulf Military Analysis, among other institutions. These questions are being answered by a top-tier specialist in military strategy and defense affairs. I would also like to ask the following question. The Middle Corridor. Mr. Karasik, the Middle Corridor and transcontinental transportation are often mentioned as alternatives to Russian routes. In your opinion, how realistic is it that this corridor will increase in significance in the coming years, and what role does China play in this context?
The corridor that's being developed and its trunks are continuing on the east-west front, are continuing to grow, and China is plugged into this route because of international trade agreements. Now, the China card here is seen by some states as a plus, for example, in Central Asia. But I think as you move further west on this line of logistics, you begin to run into questions about what China's objectives really are. And that's going to be a negotiating point here for the coming year or so about China's role in westward movement of goods and services. Now, having said that, it's important to note that all along the middle corridor, Gulf states, particularly the UAE, owns many of the ports that are being used in this middle corridor, particularly through the Caucasus and into the Black Sea. This is a very interesting phenomena of how a state like the UAE uses ports and logistics to help build up their political capital and economic gain through the construction of logistics services that are now going to be augmented by artificial intelligence. And that is the plan, if you will, for the coming years of further integration of this middle corridor and how trunks of it may interact, if you will, with other parts of the region. The one that I focus on is that I find most interesting is the part involving Azerbaijan and places, locations south of there. You have this idea for Discovery Road, which seems to be moving forward, but a little locked up on some negotiations with Iraqi factions. But the idea of getting product, if you will, from the Caspian region down to the northern part of the Persian Gulf is really a key route. And this would change the way that goods and services move through that area, but also gives an extra kick for China, because China does a lot of the port construction on behalf of Kuwait. For example, they're doing the construction of Fa Peninsula, and Kuwait is also hiring Chinese for port construction. So there's a nexus here of Chinese interests in logistics that ride along the middle corridor and its trunks that the UAE and some other Gulf states participate in order to redraw the transportation and logistics map while trying to cut Russia out in the current environment.
You are well familiar with the Caucasus Triangle of Baku, Tbilisi, Yerevan. In your view, can we expect Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan to form a similar strategic configuration on the eastern flank, or will they remain more in a state of competition?
There is a very strong effort ongoing to integrate Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan more closely, but I think that you need to include Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan in this as well, because they all calculate into rail networks that are being developed, discussed, and maybe even implemented. But to go back to a minute about Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, because of their history, because of the leadership, and so on, there's a natural tendency to work together in this new economic reality that we're in now. And the politics of it means to lower temperatures between the two countries, agree on borders, and to develop bilateral relations that are positive and that are Western leaning. That's why you see a lot of the European and Western interests traveling to these two countries in order to better incorporate them into the Western world, away from Russia, but also to tease them away from China, which is probably more difficult to do because Central Asia is China's backyard. So how Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are treated by the West is very important to keep in mind, because of Chinese interests. You want to be able to maintain an advantage over the interests of Beijing, but at the same time, these local states, if you will, need to work with them, and the Western mind needs to understand that. The Gulf mind understands it perfectly, but the Western mind needs to develop their thinking a bit more. And being proactive right now is really important as these shifts are occurring between, or this integration, if you will, between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. You'll notice that the leaderships in both countries are undergoing a bit of a change. In Kazakhstan, the old order of Nazarbayev is finally seems to be leaving. I read the other day that his property is actually up for sale, which is a very interesting indicator. Meanwhile, in Uzbekistan, the president's daughter has garnered more power as the head of the presidential administration. And the interaction between these two states now at that top political level becomes ever more important.
The question of demography and radicalization. Back in the 2000s, you warned about the risks of Islamism in Central Asia. How would you assess the current situation in the Fergana Valley and in southern Kazakhstan? Do you see a threat of conflict or, on the contrary, opportunities for stabilization?
Back when that was written, much of Central Asia questions were surrounding border demarcation and protection from each other, particularly around Fergana, because it has such a violent history that goes back even further than the Soviet period. The point is that since the writing of that piece and the focus on trying to resolve historical issues of demarcation, this is what the result has been, is that the Central Asian states have recognized that within their history that they need to fix a lot of what the Soviets imprinted on them. When writing about this 20 or 30 years ago, it was clear that Fergana is the swirling enigma of Central Asia and Stalin's trap. It's no longer that per se because of the hard work of various parties in Kyrgyzstan, in Tajikistan, and in Uzbekistan to try to resolve these border issues so that each state is able to proceed with its reform programs and to stand up more on their own. The border agreements between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, to me, are the most important because they're the most dangerous given the groups that live around those areas and who have, excuse me, who have property rights in mind and whose land belongs to whom. It seems that these negotiations have progressed and talk is good. So as long as the talking is ongoing and there's demarcation going up and there are little property swaps occurring between various groups in the Fergana Valley, this might tend to make that issue go away. The only way that might come back up again, for example, is the introduction or reintroduction of some kind of Islamist trait, but that would only be used as a tool, a political tool by either an outside power or a neighboring power who has a connection to Moscow.
Dear friend, could you please tell us, is the water crisis more likely to trigger a war, or could it become a platform for collective regional solutions to water management? And if it is a trigger for war, in your view, where could such a conflict potentially begin?
In the current Eurasian theater, clearly Ukraine and Russia is already busy. In Central Asia, we're not really seeing an outbreak of any kind of hostility that would be generated by Moscow per se. Moscow's concentration on Central Asia is using disruption operations for the most part and information warfare, but also maintaining close ties to the leaders who grew up during the Soviet period. For me, when I'm looking at Kremlin's strategy and how Putin and Patrushev and Naryshkin are looking at the world, they're looking at the world in four directions, not just to Europe. They're looking south, they're looking north to the Arctic, and they're looking east towards North Korea, who's now a key ally. The next real war, I think, or outbreak of hostilities is probably going to be in the Baltics, particularly around Kaliningrad and the Baltic Sea. This seems to be a favorite of the of the Russian leadership, and because not much changes, and
of course.
and so when you listen to Patrushev or to Naryshkin, anybody from the services, they're always talking about looking at the Baltics or the Northern Passage and keeping it open, the Arctic, because there's a wall going up between that runs really from Finland, Murmansk, all the way down to, I could draw this in a lecture, all the way down to the tip of South Africa. And this wall is dividing the Russian sphere of influence, or in attempting to divide it, although Russia's deep in Africa already. But having said that, it's the Baltics that they're really focusing on with electronic measures and with underwater sabotage and on-land sabotage. These kinds of operations are really key. And you'll notice that the Russians are now picking a lot on not only the Baltic states and Kaliningrad in particular, but also Moldova because of the presence of Russian troops there. This is an angle that they can play, and there's a lot of articles coming out from the services in Russia about how Moldova is this weak spot. So it's clear to me that Russia is focusing more on the European theater and ways to complicate issues there, as opposed to really operating, let's say, to try to make a fight in Central Asia. If anything, they're going to try to make a strategic distraction in the Pacific because most analysts are very myopic. They're only looking at it in one direction, their own. But you have to put yourself in the Kremlin seat. And when you're in the Kremlin seat, you're looking in four directions. In the old days, these were called TVD. It still applies. And so this is the danger here of not understanding Russia well enough to see that they might do something that will take Westerners by surprise. They can be quite clever sometimes, but we'll see how clever they are in the next 90 days.
Dear friend, help me understand. Does a project called Greater Central Asia or Greater Afghanistan actually exist? If it does, what exactly is this project about? And one last point within this question. What is Afghanistan for the peoples of Central Asia, a threat or a partner?
Question. Afghanistan under the Taliban rule seems to have really solidified their hold on power, governance, getting contracts from all kinds of different parties, particularly with China, which I find very interesting for mineral extraction. But more importantly, right now for Central Asia, is that Russia has recognized the Taliban, and at the same time, Central Asian states are signing major contracts with the Taliban for transportation routes. The idea of a greater Afghanistan or Taliban per se, I think, is been reduced to an idea of how do we just help the Taliban stay in power, fight those that we Central Asians are against, in order so that any product that is moving to the south through Iran or through Afghanistan does not meet any kind of resistance. As we know, there's been a lot of problems with transportation routes and local discontent with those, and violence has emerged. But for Afghanistan, that threat to the soft underbelly of Central Asia doesn't seem to exist quite the same as it did just even 5 years ago. The situation there has changed dramatically. I think that because of the Gulf presence in Afghanistan and the way that some of the Gulf states have advertised Afghanistan to the Central Asian states as a route is part of the dynamics that are occurring today. And that, to me, signals that Afghanistan there's an attempt to incorporate it while trying to control the Islamic terrorist part of the mapping and to keep it in a dull roar as new complaints and arguments begin to arise. So the CT file, the counterterrorism file, will be something that will need to be continued, and I wouldn't be surprised to see more joint exercises on the CT front between Central Asia and perhaps the Taliban special forces, because they need to control borders and to prevent illicit flows.
I have two final questions. The first one is, in your view, are we witnessing a war of ideological narratives between Shiism, Sunnism, various Sunni models such as Talibanism or Wahhabism, or is this primarily a war for resources?
Question. Let me address the Islamic factor first. Islam continues to be a major driver of societies throughout the region, of course, and we're not seeing the sectarianism that we did in the past. That doesn't mean it can't return. At the same time, we're seeing Iran, which is a Shiite dominant power, the Islamic Republic, undergoing its own, I would say, catharsis or moment. And we just had Ashura in the Shiite religion. And this came at a very interesting time. And to watch Ashura processions, they were really kind of limited to key areas, which shows me that perhaps the Shiite version of Islam is facing a moment of transfiguration. The Sunnis, in the meantime, of course, through their force schools, etc., are continuing to shape the region, but through programs that either emphasize the cultural aspects of the religion as opposed to proselytizing and making more mosques and more Qurans. It's more of a social cultural awakening, and that's why it's interesting to watch Central Asian leaders or officials come to Mecca and Medina to do Hajj, because it's illustrative of the interaction of Islam between two regions. The politics of it, I think, is kind of a side issue. Of course, these leaders meet with each other after such religious pilgrimage, and maybe there's some business being done there. But this interaction of religion and what's happening in the arena regarding Islam is now shifting. And you're seeing the shift most notably in Syria, because the way that Syria has been flipped and now is against particular strains of Islam, particularly the political part of, let's say, the Ikhwan or the Muslim Brotherhood. See, there's now, if you're looking at Islam and in its structures or strictures, you're seeing it beginning to go after the Brotherhood, which to them is damaging Europe, and these groups of people who support this movement within Islam want to bring it into the European theater in which to reform and to prevent further spread of what is seen as anti-Western behavior. So this Islamic, this Umrah, if you will, is, of course, shifting, but it's got culture first and politics second. And the jury is still out on exactly where this is going to go. Is that fair?
Final question. As a professor, scholar, and analyst, Mr. Ted, which future scenarios do you consider most realistic for Central Asia by 2030? Do you see the region moving towards institutional alignment with the West, shifting under Chinese dominance, or forming a new multipolar axis centered around the Persian Gulf? What is your view?
Future outlook, if you're doing futures to 2030, 2040, 2050, the outlook for Central Asia is actually rather positive because of the nature of where it sits. That geography is now going to play a big role as global economics continue their move eastward. Now, there are a couple of factors here, of course, when you're doing long range futures is, well, what will happen with the war between Ukraine and Russia? And more importantly, what will happen to Russia when those hostilities end? What will Russia look like? No one has a good answer. And I think that's part of the intrigue to this question about what will happen in Central Asia. Some people would argue that in that time frame that a weakened Russia would mean that an empowered China would take part of eastern Siberia under its wing and move further west in a more aggressive manner while trying to capture Taiwan at the same time. In fact, ask yourself, will China capture Taiwan within that time period? Most likely. So if China has captured Taiwan in that time period, what is the impact on Central Asia and its relationship with China? Are they going to feel like they need to get under the Chinese umbrella more, or are they going to be under a Western umbrella that had been developed over time, but maybe ran into a brick wall, literally, with the Ukraine-Russia confrontation? So there are a lot of unknowns here, but on the current trajectory now, one would have to argue that Central Asia will be better integrated between East and West and South, but also leaving most of and being very cautious about what is occurring to their north. Their exits, if you will, for logistics, for communications, and for what will be the future of society really still resides from themselves. How outside powers influence this is going to be very tricky. And I'm going to go back to the wars and outcomes, and then the resource issue, which you brought up in the question, is how much of the local resources are able to help these countries build up their capacity so that they can stand more on their own as global players. I'd like to end here this question by saying that the Gulf states the Central Asian leaders ever since, or even before the end of the Soviet Union, were always enamored with how Gulf states ruled. And I think that is still true today. I think that the Central Asian states look to the Gulf states as how they want to see themselves in the future, and they want to adopt as many of those methods as possible. And that is where further integration of the regions occur and brings prosperity, inshallah, by 2050.
Thank you.
We had the honor of welcoming one of the finest analysts, a person I personally deeply respect, our friend, Dr. Theodore Karasik. Thank you for your knowledge and for your valuable insights, which will be heard by our listeners, analysts, and diplomats, as our audience includes a professional community of diplomats, former ministers, and academic circles. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye bye.